If you've ever ended a long day with chipped beef on toast or a can of mystery meat stew, brace yourself. You might just be old. We're serving up a nostalgia-packed menu of dinners that disappeared with rotary phones and shag carpet. How many of these did you survive? After the devastation of World War II, the world needed more than just rebuilding. It needed leadership, unity, and a strong diplomatic foundation. In 1947, President Harry S. Truman hosted a pivotal state dinner to discuss these very issues, aiming to solidify America's role in post-war reconstruction and strengthen relations with Europe. Among the distinguished guests were Winston Churchill, key European leaders, and American political elites, all gathered to chart a course for the future of the Western world. The menu featured baked ham, a hearty American classic, paired with sweet potatoes, a dish that evoked a sense of home and tradition. For dessert, there was cherry pie, a quintessentially American treat, symbolizing the nation's resilience and optimism in the face of global challenges. To accompany the meal, Truman served wine and champagne, raising a glass to the hope of a prosperous, cooperative future. The dinner served as a backdrop for high-stakes discussions on the Marshall Plan and other post-war initiatives. With Europe in ruins, Truman and his guests discussed how the U.S. would lead the way in rebuilding the continent and preventing the spread of communism. Churchill, ever the wit, joked that Truman was much more hospitable than our British dinners, adding that the cherry pie was the true weapon of mass reconstruction. Sometimes even diplomacy requires a little sweetness. Another one you might be surprised to see in a video about medieval-era recipes is honey and oat cakes. Oats were really common in northern and western regions like Ireland, Scandinavia, and Scotland, and this was because the climate was really cold. It was much easier to grow them than, let's say, wheat. Oats were something that would thrive in poor soils, and they also had shorter growing seasons, which meant that they became a pristine source of food when times were tough and you were running low in your pantry. A very basic oat cake would typically be made from coarsely ground oatmeal, water, and some salt, and this mix would be made into a slightly hard dough, rolled very thin, and then cooked on a baking stone. These were durable, portable, and crispy, so they were the perfect meal for long journeys. Alongside some honey, which was the primary sweetener before sugar, it was one of the best meals you could have for celebrations. While people did use them in their daily lives, rural peasants most often got to enjoy them during festivals and religious holidays in monasteries. It's also interesting to note that honey was seen as a bounty of the earth that carried divine favor, and so honey and oat cakes were seen as a good blessing for wedding feasts. Homemade meatloaf, the best-kept secret for stretching a small amount of meat into a full meal. In hard times, buying enough ground beef for the whole family was a challenge, to say the least. But meatloaf came to the rescue. That makes it sound like a superhero. But in a way, it was. The trick was to add breadcrumbs, oats, or whatever filler you had in the house, mix it all up, and you've got yourself a meal that could feed many. Meatloaf was a sort of blank canvas for creative chefs. You could toss in onions, ketchup, or mustard, plus you could top it off with the famous ketchup glaze. The end result was a meal that felt satisfying, even though you'd sneakily cut the meat with cheaper ingredients. The beauty of meatloaf was that no two recipes were ever the same. Each household had its own version, depending on what they had in the pantry. And let's not forget the most important part, the leftovers. They were good the next day too. Some would say even better. You could slice it up for sandwiches or reheat it for another dinner. It was a comfort food at its finest. Cheap, simple, budget-friendly, and packed with flavor, so you forgot what it actually was. Tracing back to soups for biscuits and sausage gravy. Okay. This southern staple might still be a thing in some parts of the country, but let's be real, biscuits and sausage gravy is definitely not dominating breakfast menus anymore. I guess waffles are to blame for that. But this breakfast legend is the perfect combination of fluffy buttermilk biscuits so light and airy they practically melt in your mouth, along with a creamy sausage gravy, rich with savory sausage and speckled with black pepper. This is a breakfast, or hey, no judgment here, even a dinner combination that's pure comfort food heaven. From the perfect hangover cure to a delicious weekend treat, biscuits and sausage gravy satisfy all cravings. Just maybe lay off the white clothes while you're indulging. That sausage gravy can be a bit enthusiastic when it comes to staining. In working-class kitchens, the best meals weren't always planned. They were thrown together with whatever was available. A pound of ground beef, a can of tomatoes, some diced potatoes, and a handful of elbow macaroni could turn into a thick, hearty stew that stuck to your ribs and stretched across multiple meals. Some called it slumgullion, others just called it dinner. Dishes like this had no strict recipe, just a basic formula, cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. One night it might be heavy on potatoes, the next, macaroni took center stage. Some families added onions for flavor, while others bulked it up with beans or whatever vegetables were left in the fridge. The name slumgullion had been around since the 1800s, used by miners and sailors to describe a hodgepodge meal, proof that resourceful cooking had always been part of survival. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins in the 1960s, and canned tomatoes provided flavor without the cost of fresh produce. With a simple pot and a little seasoning, this one-dish meal fed entire families with ease. It was the kind of food that tasted even better the next day, reheated on the stove after a long shift or a day at school. Comfort food without the price tag. Swiss chard is a leafy green we don't hear too much about anymore, and that was the case back then too. I don't blame people, since its glory days were definitely before the 20th century. But people remembered this little green once again during the Dust Bowl. People would pair this up with white bean soup, which was something that the masses found it very hard to live without. Why? They were a fabulous source of protein, they are affordable, you could even forage them, and these could actually be stored for months. This was a time where people were desperate for protein, by the way. A lot of good cuts of meat were more expensive than ever, and just out of the reach of most common people, while a lot of other kinds of things like nuts and almonds just weren't filling you up enough for the amount of money or time it would take to get enough of them. You had to be really smart with every cent, so people would go for things like white bean soup with Swiss chard. This was a versatile combination that had every pro health-wise on top of being something that could feed the entire family and be made with minimal effort. Cheesy broccoli and rice casserole is a dish that may just be the ultimate comfort food. It's the kind of meal that fills the house with an irresistible aroma, combining the earthiness of broccoli, the warmth of rice, and the creamy richness of cheese. Its popularity skyrocketed in the 1960s, when casseroles became a go-to for busy families looking for easy, satisfying meals. The origin of this casserole can be traced back to the post-war era when convenience foods like canned soups and processed cheeses took center stage. The combination of broccoli and rice, often bound together with a can of creamy mushroom soup, was an affordable and filling way to stretch ingredients. Over time, home cooks started adding their own twists, incorporating cheddar cheese, garlic, and even a crunchy breadcrumb topping for texture. While it's easy to dismiss cheesy broccoli and rice casserole as just another side dish, it's also the type of meal that can easily steal the spotlight at dinner. It's a versatile dish, whether served alongside a roast chicken or as the main event for a meatless dinner. Cheesy broccoli and rice casserole is the ultimate kitchen hack. Tastes gourmet, takes no time, and leaves everyone smiling. It's the kind of dish that proves simplicity can be deliciously satisfying. Theodore Roosevelt was a man of action, whether charging up San Juan Hill or shaking up Washington politics. So it's no surprise that when he hosted a state dinner in 1905 to honor Japanese diplomats, it was nothing short of groundbreaking. This was the first modern state dinner, marking a new era in U.S. diplomacy. Held to strengthen relations with Japan following the Russo-Japanese War, the event celebrated Roosevelt's role in brokering the Treaty of Portsmouth, which earned him the Nobel Peace Prize. The guest list included Japanese diplomats, led by the Japanese ambassador, and key U.S. officials. It was a carefully orchestrated evening designed to showcase mutual respect and emphasize America's commitment to fostering peace in the Pacific. Roosevelt knew diplomacy could be as much about gestures as policies, and this dinner set the stage for warmer U.S.-Japan relations. Dinner began with mock turtle soup, followed by salmon and roast beef tenderloin. For dessert, the guests were treated to baked Alaska, a showstopper designed to impress. Roosevelt, famous for his larger-than-life personality, reportedly toasted the Japanese delegation with gusto, stating his hope for perpetual friendship between our nations. The word Mazlin actually ends up coming from mestillon in Old French, which means to mix, and that's exactly what Mazlin bread is. If you wanted an idea of what a medieval mixed loaf would look like, then look no further. It was very common to see this in England, France, and the Low Countries, especially between 1000 to 1500 years. Mazlin was one of the most common kinds of bread for a specific reason, and this is actually because the climate was decently different in medieval times. Wheat was something that was born in more humid climates, so it struggled in northern and upland areas. Rye was a lot more reliable, on the other hand. It was known for also producing a darker bread that would keep you full for longer. People would get whatever wheat they had, mix it with rye, and get this loaf that was dense from rye but fluffy and soft from the wheat. It was a very interesting kind of loaf, really, and while we have several mixed grain breads in today's time, this was one of the easiest ways to spice up your daily routine back then. While we're on the topic of rice, my personal favorite, rice pudding. A sweet reminder that nothing should go to waste, especially not leftover rice. In the era of the Great Depression, where every rice grain was counted, families found a way to turn yesterday's leftover dinner into today's sweet dessert. Rice pudding became the ultimate budget-friendly treat, transforming something simple into something comforting and sweet with just a little sugar, milk, and a dash of cinnamon if you were feeling particularly fancy. I know leftover rice seems kind of blah, but once it simmers into something that looks and smells like pudding, you'll forget what you were even talking about. Plus, it was an easy way to turn ingredients you had into something new, which saved you money and a trip to the store. It felt like a real treat even in lean times, and that's why it was so popular among families. A warm bowl of rice pudding could brighten up the end of any meal, turning frugality into a moment of indulgence. So even though it started as a way to cut food waste, it stayed a family favorite that warmed up even the coldest hearts in those freezing times. Back in the 1950s, the Divan Parisian restaurant at Chatham Hotel in New York City gave birth to its signature dish, the Chicken Divan Casserole. This mouth-watering dish soon found its way to all our homes, and I'm not complaining. It's made of tender chicken pieces nestled amongst vibrant green broccoli florets in a rich and creamy sauce, topped with a generous layer of melty cheese and a sprinkle of crispy breadcrumbs. The chef who leaked this recipe out to the public really took one for the team, and we can never thank him enough. It's the perfect combination of protein, veggies, and all the cheesy goodness your heart desires. Just maybe pair it with a side salad to pretend you're being healthy. Chicken Divan Casserole is the retro dish of every cheese lover's dreams, and you know what that calls for? A comeback. It's a classic at throwback parties, but you don't really need an excuse to cook this up. A typical Tuesday night works too. Eggs and milk, two of the most basic ingredients in any 1960s kitchen, were the foundation of a meal that felt more like a science experiment than dinner. Floating Island dinner, as it was sometimes called, involved poaching eggs in a thin milk broth, then serving them over toast with a dusting of paprika. It was cheap, it was filling, and while it may have looked unusual, it made the most of what families had on hand. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and relatively inexpensive compared to meat. Poaching them in milk was a way to add richness without using butter or oil, and the broth itself didn't go to waste. It soaked into the toast, creating a soft, custard-like texture that was surprisingly satisfying. Paprika wasn't just for color. It added a hint of warmth and spice to an otherwise mild dish. This kind of meal had roots in old-fashioned frugality. Similar recipes had been around for generations, passed down from an era when every ingredient had to serve a purpose. For kids, it was a bit of a mystery. Why was dinner floating? But for parents, it was an easy, one-pan solution that turned a few simple staples into something warm and nourishing at the end of a long day. So naturally, people did a few other things with kale than the ones we've gone over so far. One of those was a kale and chickpea stir-fry, which actually got a lot more positive PR than you would think. Seriously, before this decade, chickpeas never had this kind of clout. Suddenly, they were the Wagyu steak of America, though. It was all you ever really wanted to get your hands on. Kale was still something that was difficult for the American masses to consume regularly, but it was a work in progress. That stir-fry definitely made it a lot more digestible for most, and people didn't have the option of saying no based on their tastes. If it was there, and especially if it wasn't spoiled, you would suck it up and simply eat. What else were you to do? Turn down the perfectly good plate of food in the horrible, historically chaotic drought and recession going on? Plus, this was a good way to check off a lot of nutritional boxes that were otherwise going unfulfilled. While kale was a bit hard to get in some areas, typically ones that were farther away from markets, it was still something people got their hands on eventually, usually thanks to family. Chickpeas weren't that hard to get, and the rest was just a matter of getting on the stove and putting in the work, which was really hard, mind you. People were exhausted. Side dish that has graced American tables for decades. Despite its name, it's actually more of a Mexican-American creation, born out of the fusion of traditional Spanish and Mexican cooking. The rich, savory base comes from simmering rice in a seasoned tomato sauce, with green peppers adding a touch of sweetness and color. The origins of Spanish rice can be traced to the influence of the Spanish in Mexico during the colonial period. The use of rice as a staple ingredient spread throughout Latin America, evolving into countless variations. In the United States, especially during the mid-20th century, Spanish rice became a popular side dish to accompany everything from tacos to fried chicken. The addition of green peppers, onions, and garlic to the dish added layers of flavor that made it even more satisfying. Spanish rice with tomatoes and peppers is the side dish that's just as colorful as it is delicious. So much flavor, it almost steals the show. It's a versatile, easy-to-make dish that always pairs well with a variety of main courses. Gerald Ford's presidency began under challenging circumstances, with the U.S. recovering from the turmoil of the Watergate scandal. In 1974, Ford hosted a state dinner that aimed to restore both domestic and international confidence in the U.S. administration. This dinner was as much about diplomacy and rebuilding trust as it was about the carefully chosen menu designed to impress European leaders and key U.S. political figures. The evening featured a sumptuous array of dishes, starting with beef Wellington, an elegant dish showcasing perfectly cooked beef wrapped in puff pastry, a symbol of refinement. Lobster Newburg followed, an indulgent and decadent dish popular in upscale dining circles. For dessert, Ford's guests were treated to a rich chocolate mousse, a fitting end to an evening meant to impress both the taste buds and the political world. The guest list included European leaders, notably from NATO countries, and influential U.S. political elites. The purpose of the dinner was clear. Ford wanted to assure the world that the U.S. was steady, strong, and ready to maintain its leadership role in the face of post-Watergate uncertainty. It was about rebuilding the nation's reputation and fostering stronger relationships with Europe. Baked turnips with herbs is an example of how even a simple and humble root vegetable can be turned into something that gets your kids at the table if you know what you're doing. Luckily, medieval-era cooks had a lot of room for trial and error, and they definitely learned a few things about working with turnips. While baking them was never as common as stewing or boiling them, it was extremely good. Households that had the privilege of a bake oven would abuse that luxury maliciously, in fact. That's just how nice it was. In households where that wasn't a thing, Tay turnips were typically wrapped in kale or cabbage leaves and then baked in ashes or at the edges of a hearth. This was a pretty rustic method, but it would help to soften the turnip, and it let the herbs introduce some much-needed flavor. Of course, you had to be very careful that what you were doing wasn't going to burn the turnips. Monasteries were most commonly known for preparing turnips, and they relied pretty much entirely on olive oil and butter. This resulting dish was something that was really earthy and savory, but the herbs helped when it came to the taste of turnips. For some, that taste can be really overwhelming. Break time. 1 second. Moving away from the cheesy, creamy dishes, we are now in the turnip and carrot hash territory. Now please listen to this. I know how it sounds, but give it a chance. I mean, our ancestors did eat this at some point in time. It's not inedible. When potatoes were too precious to waste, turnips were the ones who took over their spotlight. During hard times, turnips, these beasts of root vegetables, were everyone's go-to for stretching meals. As for the preparation, there's not much to say. Just chop turnips and carrots, throw them in a pot with some oil, and let them sizzle until they're golden brown. As they cook, their earthy flavors will come together and create the perfect hash. I love a good hash, honestly. This one in particular didn't really catch my eye, but hey, who am I to judge? Maybe it's a once-in-a-lifetime dining experience. Who knows? I think it would taste much better with some meat in it, and our ancestors agreed with that statement. Plus, it's the kind of dish that could easily be turned into a breakfast if you cracked one egg and fired it. So, whether you were craving breakfast, lunch, or dinner, turnip and carrot hash could fill your every desire. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky, golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period, around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. Cabbage was a lifesaver for working-class families. It was cheap, filling, and could be stretched into countless meals. But one of the more unusual ways it made it to the dinner table was in the form of a baked pudding. Boiled cabbage mixed with eggs and flour, then baked until firm and sliced like meatloaf. It may not have looked like much, but for families on a tight budget, cabbage pudding was a way to turn simple ingredients into something hearty and satisfying. Eggs provided the structure, binding everything together while adding much-needed protein. Flour thickened the mixture, giving it a firm texture that could be sliced and served like a main course. The cabbage itself, soft from boiling, took on a milder flavor, making it an easy dish to pair with whatever else was on hand. Some families seasoned it with a bit of salt and pepper, while others added a splash of milk for extra richness. For those who grew up on it, this dish was part of a long tradition of making the most out of humble ingredients. Whether eaten hot from the oven or reheated the next day, it was proof that even the simplest vegetables could be transformed into something filling, practical, and, at least for some, comforting. Cabbage steaks with garlic sauce were another example of that mock food culture I was talking about. So that's definitely a bit of a stretch when it comes to what exactly can classify as an imitation and not just flat-out blasphemy. Cabbage steaks actually did end up coming close, though. People got really creative during the Dust Bowl because of how they just had nothing to work with. Poor harvests full of failed crops, scarcity, and just the general circumstances of every average day were really pushing them to their limits. Still, what hit really badly wasn't how hard everything was, but how rare the normal things had become. A good steak, chicken nuggets, some nice hash browns, a good Christmas, stuff like that. It was these little everyday joys that completely went out of people's lives that made the biggest difference. This is also exactly why people began to imitate things like steaks. Cabbage steaks were really thick slices of cabbage, so they'd have a bit of a weighty bite to them, and then they would be roasted and grilled until they were crispy. Then people would make a garlic sauce with it and serve it as is. The sad part of this whole thing was that cabbage steaks were honestly just something that the people living with ovens could afford. You needed to preheat the oven for this and use baking paper, which weren't things that people were able to spend their money on. A true testament to how simple ingredients can create something extraordinary, corn pudding casserole with a sweet custard base is a comforting classic. With its rich, custardy texture and subtle sweetness, it's a comforting side that's just as at home at Thanksgiving as it is at a Sunday family dinner. Corn pudding has roots in early American cooking, influenced by Native American corn-based dishes like succotash. However, the casserole version, often made with a combination of cornmeal, eggs, milk, and sugar, emerged in the 19th century as settlers began adapting recipes to make use of what was readily available. The sweet custard base, made with eggs and cream or milk, gives the dish its signature smooth, slightly sweet texture that contrasts perfectly with the corn kernels. It's also a dish that evolved with convenience in mind. As canned creamed corn became widely available in the mid-20th century, many home cooks began using it to simplify preparation without sacrificing flavor. Corn pudding is a crowd pleaser, and its versatility allows for adjustments. Some might add a touch of cheese, while others prefer to keep it pure. James Monroe's state dinners were nothing short of diplomatic celebrations, embodying the optimism of the era of good feelings. These gatherings were designed to underscore the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, a bold declaration that the Western Hemisphere was off-limits to European interference. The guest list included foreign dignitaries, with special attention given to representatives from newly independent Latin American nations. These dinners symbolized U.S. support for their sovereignty while asserting America's emerging leadership in the hemisphere. It was Monroe's way of saying, "Welcome to the neighborhood, just don't let Europe drop by uninvited." The menu, like the political messaging, was hearty and deliberate. Guests dined on roast beef, baked ham, lobster salad, and jelly cakes, a spread designed to highlight both American abundance and refinement. Lobster salad, in particular, offered a touch of coastal elegance, while jelly cakes, a popular dessert of the era, provided a sweet conclusion. Monroe's wife, Elizabeth, brought a touch of French sophistication to these events, thanks to her years abroad. She ensured the dinners blended Old World refinement with New World pride. One observer noted the meals were a diplomatic banquet as much as a culinary one. In Monroe's hands, even a slice of ham could carry a message: America was here to stay. Black bread and ripping is one of those dishes that may not have any specific, notable history with it, but one that says something about the people that make it. First, let's start with what black bread is. It was the everyday bread of the citizens and rural folk of Northern and Eastern Europe. From Russia to Scandinavia and Poland, black bread, this distinctly dark, coarse bread made out of rye, bran, and maslin, was an incredibly hard bread. It would stale quickly, and back then, they didn't even have that many preservatives. Still, it was one of the few kinds of sustainable breads people could make with the grains they had. So what were they to do? People were going to adapt, that's what. And adapt they did. This is where dripping comes in. It's just lard, by the way, but it would transform the texture of the bread. What was just a hard and rough loaf of bread would suddenly soften, become warmer, and become a lot better to bite into. The crispy brown pits in the roast pan would have been mixed in, and they really added to the vibe of the dish a lot more. The dripping flavor would also be different depending on what kind of animal people would use, and pork dripping was the most common one. So, there you have black bread and dripping, a dish that reminds you of how people will find any way to get by. Mock chicken legs, a true culinary illusion of the Great Depression. When actual chicken legs were too expensive to buy, people had to get creative, crafting drumsticks out of inexpensive cuts of meat like pork or veal and shaping them to look like the real thing. These so-called legs were then breaded, fried, or baked and served up with high hopes that no one would notice the difference. And honestly, in times as hard as those, nobody even cared which meat they were having, as long as it tasted good and filled you up. The beauty of mock chicken legs is that for a split second, you would forget that it wasn't an actual chicken leg on your plate, rather something that resembled one. It was a brilliant way for families to serve something that felt like a treat without the high cost. Plus, let's give a shout out to all those women who shaped that meat to look like a drumstick. That takes a certain level of dedication. It's a testament to how far people were willing to go to make ends meet while still putting something fun on the table. Mock chicken legs became household favorites, proving that with a little creativity in the kitchen, you could really stretch that budget. The Hungarians really killed it with dinners that shaped our childhood, because we've got another banger on the list. Hungarian goulash was everyone's favorite cozy hearty meal back in the day. Goulash is a hearty stew whipped up with tender chunks of beef simmered in a rich, savory sauce brimming with paprika. Yeah, paprika was huge back in the day. So why did this delicious dinner vanish from our dinner tables? Well, the Hungarian goulash traces back as far as the 10th century to stews eaten by the shepherds, so you can say this one might just have run its course. But hey, if you're ever craving goulash, dust off some old cookbooks and get to work because it really isn't hard to wump up. This is the perfect dish for a chilly night in, curled up on the couch with a good movie. Just be careful not to spill it on your mom's vintage tablecloth. Those things are irreplaceable. When meat was scarce and paychecks had to stretch, dinner often started with one humble ingredient: potatoes. Cheap, filling, and always available, they could be transformed into just about anything. One particularly resourceful creation called potato sizzler involved grating them up, frying them in bacon drippings with a handful of onions, and stirring in a beaten egg to bind it all together. Crisp on the edges, hearty in the middle, and packed with smoky flavor, this simple dish had everything it needed to stand on its own as a meal. Bacon itself wasn't always in the budget, but the drippings? Those were liquid gold. Every working-class kitchen had a can of saved bacon grease sitting on the stovetop, ready to add flavor to whatever was cooking. Onions were another staple, cheap and able to stretch even the simplest dish into something satisfying. The egg, whisked in at the last moment, gave the sizzling potatoes just enough structure to hold together, making the meal feel a little more complete. For families who grew up on it, the smell of potatoes frying in a cast-iron skillet brings back memories of home. So we're going to go up to the upper-class side of things for a bit. This wasn't a dish that anyone else could have afforded to make or eat back then anyway. Homemade gnocchi with noodles was still something that the relatively well-off and affluent families in the States were able to eat, and it was entirely something limited to certain parts of big urban hubs like Chicago, New York, and Washington. Gnocchi is an Italian dish, which I'm sure you already know. What's interesting is that it actually came on over to the States thanks to Italian immigrants, and back then, it hadn't become the fine dining appetizer that it's known to be today. It wasn't exactly that pricey either. Back then, Italian communities full of immigrants were still making it whenever they could. For the gnocchi, all you would need is flour, water, and dough. These were things that were out of the reach of normal people, sure, but to people with generational wealth? Well, it was mostly business as usual. Don't get me wrong, even though they were impacted by the recession and the Dust Bowl, there wasn't a single American home that wasn't. Did they draw the short end of the stick, though? Not by a long shot. This wasn't a dish you'd see anywhere outside of real bougie neighborhoods. Roast chicken with stuffing and green beans is a meal that evokes family gatherings, holidays, and a sense of home. This classic dinner has long been a centerpiece of American dining, combining practicality with elegance. Roasting chicken is one of the oldest cooking methods, but by the 20th century, it became a weekly tradition for many households. Chickens were relatively inexpensive, easy to prepare, and, if seasoned and roasted just right, deliciously satisfying. The key to a perfect roast chicken lies in the balance: crispy, golden skin on the outside and juicy, flavorful meat inside. Stuffing or dressing, depending on your regional preference, traces back to ancient Rome. By the time it reached American kitchens, cooks used bread cubes, herbs, and sometimes vegetables to create the savory, aromatic side we know today. While traditionally cooked inside the bird, many began baking it separately for a crispier texture, what some might call progress. Green beans complete this trio, often sautéed with garlic, almonds, or a touch of bacon. They brought a fresh, vibrant contrast to the richness of the chicken and stuffing. If you roast a chicken and make stuffing, you're not just making dinner, you're making memories. And for anyone who's ever had the leftovers, the memories taste just as good the next day. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy hosted a landmark state dinner with one goal in mind: to celebrate the enduring friendship between the United States and France during the early years of the Cold War. The occasion was especially significant because it marked the first official state visit of French President Charles de Gaulle to the U.S. The dinner was a statement of cultural diplomacy, showcasing the deep ties between two nations with shared democratic values. The menu served as a tribute to French cuisine, as JFK was known for his appreciation of good food and for fostering cultural ties through it. The evening began with a rich French onion soup, followed by the main course, filet mignon with béarnaise sauce, a classic French dish that highlighted the sophistication of the French culinary tradition. Asparagus with hollandaise sauce added a refined touch, while champagne parfait offered a sweet, celebratory end to the meal. The guest list was a who's who of diplomats, with de Gaulle and other dignitaries in attendance. This dinner was a diplomatic event meant to strengthen the U.S.-France alliance at a time when both nations were seeking to navigate the tense geopolitical climate of the Cold War. Kennedy, known for his charm, reportedly remarked that the only thing more exciting than this dinner is the prospect of working together with France to build a stronger world. A meal fit for diplomacy and a toast to the power of international friendship. Lentil soups were even more common in the medieval world. They would change a lot depending on the region, though. For example, in Europe's southern regions like Provence and Spain, lentils were not only used to feed humans, but also to feed animals. Lentil pottages were one of the most important meals for the church as well, because when the fast would break, this was one of the few meals that could feed an entire group and still be very easy to prepare. Lentils would provide an incredible dose of protein, and it would need just water and a few other vegetables if you could spare them. Onions, leeks, and garlic, or just some savory or sage would work really well. In the Middle East and North Africa, lentil soups were something else entirely. Medieval Arab cookbooks like Anwa al-Saidala F. Alwan al-Atima would feature all kinds of lentil recipes with an incredible amount of flavorings, seasonings, and spices to make it stand out from other dishes. It would be a lot more bombastic and flavorful than European versions of the same dish, and if looking at today's world is any example, I think it's historically accurate to say that they've always had us beat when it comes to working with legumes. Corned beef and potato hash was a true Depression-era hero. It was affordable and filling. In a time when fresh meat was hard to come by, corned beef in a can was a lifesaver. Corned beef and potato hash was a shelf-stable, cheap, and stretchy meal. It was a dish that kept bellies full without keeping the wallets empty. The beauty of corned beef hash was in its simplicity. Fry up some chopped potatoes, toss in that canned corned beef, and let it all get crispy in the pan. Adding an onion or two added a bit of spice, but not everyone had that option available. But even if you couldn't afford onions, the combination of corned beef and potatoes was just enough. It was a meal that tasted like you put way more work in than you actually did. It was the kind of meal that could stretch to feed the whole family and still leave enough for leftovers the next day. Corned beef and potato hash wasn't just a Depression-era staple. It was proof that you didn't need fresh ingredients or fancy cooking techniques to make a hearty, filling, and tasty dish on a budget. The ground beef veggie stew is the perfect combination of simple ingredients and a big flavor. This dinner dish is a budget-friendly and nutritious dinner option made with ground beef and a variety of vegetables. Plus, it's a great way to use up any leftover vegetables you might have hanging out in your fridge. You can customize this stew to your liking. Throw in some chopped potatoes for extra starch, or add a splash of your favorite hot sauce for a kick. Ground beef. Veggie stew is a classic comfort food that's easy to make, but let's be honest, it's vanishing from our tables because it can't compete with the modern options. You know, like the Crunchwrap Supreme from Taco Bell. I bet Taco Bell doesn't remind you of your grandma and your cousins, though. Don't you love low-effort foods where you can just throw in the ingredients and let your slow cooker do all the work? Well, you would have loved festive, slow-cooked beef tips. As the name suggests, this one was a favorite at festive dinner parties and people couldn't stop raving about it. It's very simple, too. Tender beef tips simmered low and slow in a savory sauce brimming with flavor. You can customize the sauce to your liking. Add some red wine for a touch of sophistication, or maybe ranch if you aren't feeling fancy. No judgment here. Festive, slow-cooked beef tips are perfect for a busy weeknight or a casual weekend gathering. Just pop it in the slow cooker before you head out the door and come home to a delicious meal waiting for you. Prunes were an economical way to add natural sweetness and nutrition to the dinner table. In the 1960s, they were whipped into an airy, soufflé-like casserole made with egg whites and sugar, then baked until golden brown. Prune whip casserole was light, fluffy, and packed with more vitamins than most desserts, even if its name didn't exactly spark excitement. Dried fruit had long been a staple in budget-conscious households, offering a shelf-stable source of fiber and nutrients. Prunes, in particular, were affordable and widely available, making them a practical choice for families looking to stretch ingredients. Beaten egg whites gave the dish its signature lift, while a touch of sugar helped balance the prune's deep, molasses-like flavor. It wasn't quite a dessert, but it wasn't entirely savory either, somewhere in between, landing on the dinner table as an odd but wholesome option. Many who grew up with it remember the sight of it puffing up in the oven, only to deflate slightly as it cooled. It was a product of its time, when home economics stressed the importance of using what was on hand to create something nourishing. One of the other things that was pushed to the mainstream thanks to the Dust Bowl was the reliance on one-pot meals. Stuff like vegetable pot pie with a biscuit crust really made the rounds just about everywhere. It was because it was so easy to pool together different kinds of vegetables to make one massive serving of pot pie, oftentimes more than just for a family. People would basically realize this. If they shared the amount of vegetables and resources they had, they could honestly make a lot more. Community-based ingredient sharing and food preparation once again became a thing. Entire neighborhoods were once again eating together, and it was a big part of how people managed to survive. This pot pie was a one-stop solution to massive amounts of hunger, and often people would throw in whatever kind of vegetables they had in there. This would typically look like your average mix of cabbage, onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes, and the rest, but people would try to add in aromatics to get some flavor going too. It was little stuff like this that really helped keep things together for everyone because, on their own, people didn't have the energy to cook big meals like this very often. Steamed clams, a beloved dish especially along the coasts of New England, have been enjoyed for generations. This dish is a true celebration of seafood, as fresh clams are steamed until tender, absorbing all the flavors of the broth, often seasoned with garlic, herbs, and a splash of white wine or broth. Clams, which are bivalve mollusks, have been a staple in coastal cuisine for centuries, with Native Americans harvesting them long before European settlers arrived. The joy of eating steamed clams comes from their delicate texture and briny sweetness. The perfect clam should pop open easily when steamed, a sign that it's cooked just right. Paired with a slice of hearty brown bread and a dollop of butter, this dish becomes a complete, satisfying meal. The richness of the butter and the rustic flavor of the brown bread perfectly complement the clam's natural saltiness, creating a balanced, indulgent experience. Steamed clams with brown bread, because sometimes the best meals are the ones that come with their own dipping sauce. The dish reflects the simplicity of coastal living, proving that the freshest ingredients often make the most memorable meals. Whether served as an appetizer or a main course, steamed clams with brown bread and butter remain a timeless favorite, offering a taste of the sea with every bite. Ronald Reagan's state dinner in 1982 was a celebration of the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, two nations united by shared values and Cold War concerns. Held in honor of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the dinner was designed to reinforce the strong ties between the two countries at a time when global tensions were high. The menu was a showcase of American grandeur, with dishes that exemplified the best of U.S. hospitality. The meal began with poached salmon, elegantly presented and accompanied by a light, flavorful sauce. The main course featured filet mignon, tender and perfectly seared, an indulgent American classic. For dessert, guests enjoyed a decadent chocolate soufflé, a sweet and sophisticated finale to the evening. The guest list was a carefully curated mix of global leaders and key political figures, with Thatcher taking center stage. The dinner was about reaffirming the strategic alliance between the US and the UK during a time of geopolitical uncertainty, particularly in Europe. Cabbage and onion soup was a medieval recipe that's pretty much stayed consistent with how we have it today. It was something that involved a watery, thin soup made out of spices, water, and some aromatics, and brought to a boil gradually. This would be done in earthen pots over a campfire, and it was one of the most perfect things to have during winter. While the preparation is largely the same across several centuries, the convenience isn't. As time went on, we obviously developed many things to cope with the long and harsh winter months, but on the flip side of things, when it was medieval times, people really just died in the winters, mostly out of hunger. Crops simply would not last, would not sprout in time. Some of the crops would fail, the land may simply go barren, or you may just not have damaged crops from rodents. Any one of these uncontrollable, unpredictable circumstances could essentially just ruin your entire year. Cabbage was important because it was very easy to store in the winter. As far as the nutrition goes, this is pretty okay when it comes to making sure you get everything you need. Comparatively, it was a lot better than other kinds of soups because it could be made very easily. The more convenient it was to make a dish, the more it would be preferred among the people, especially if it was very easy to grow it. Cabbage could also be used to make a lot of different kinds of things, so it was always worth it to invest in them. Onions were a very reliable vegetable because they were one of the most essential flavorings. The food back then was typically bland, and they didn't have the means to make it any tastier, but stuff like this helped a lot. Boiled dinner featuring corned beef and cabbage was the ultimate meat stretch of its time. People had to find ways to make a little go a long way, and nothing could to it as good as a boiled dinner. Just imagine that you've got a hunk of corned beef, some cabbage that's, let's be honest, seen better days, and a few potatoes hanging out in the pantry, and voila, dinner is served. Throw everything in one pot, add water, and let it simmer until the meat is tender and the vegetables soften. It is a meal that practically cooks itself while you sit back and enjoy some quality time with your family, or while you chase your kids around the house. But the leftovers are the real prize. You can turn them into sandwiches and hash, and you can even use the leftover broth for a new soup. This boiled dinner is the perfect reminder that with just a bit of creativity, you can whip up a delicious meal even when money is tight. Now, Swiss steak is like a warm hug from the past. This dish is all about slow-cooked, fall-apart tender beef bathed in a tangy tomato sauce. Think slow cooker vibes, but way before slow cookers were even a thing. Now, the Swiss steak is all about patience. The longer you simmer the beef, the more melt-in-your-mouth delicious it becomes. It's also the perfect way to use up that tougher cut of meat you accidentally grabbed at the store. If you grew up thinking this dish was from Switzerland, as the name suggests, now would be a good time for me to tell you your whole life was a lie. This technique of cooking up tender meat came from England, so they're the ones to thank for this meaty goodness. I can just imagine the satisfying experience of cutting through that tender beef with minimal effort. Swiss steak, a dinner-time classic that deserves a comeback. Where do I sign the petition? When tomato sauce wasn't in the pantry and butter wasn't an option, a surprising combination stepped in: mayonnaise and mustard. Tossed with hot spaghetti noodles and seasoned with a dash of salt and pepper, this unusual pairing became a quick-fix meal known as mayo and mustard spaghetti, which was both budget-friendly and undeniably memorable. Spaghetti itself was one of the most affordable dry goods available, filling enough to feed a family without requiring much else. Mayonnaise, often stocked in refrigerators for sandwiches and salads, brought richness and a creamy texture, while mustard added just enough tang to keep things interesting. It wasn't gourmet, but it turned plain pasta into something that felt like a complete dish without the need for meat, cheese, or expensive sauces. In working-class households, meals like this weren't about following a recipe. They were about making do with what was available. Kids grew up eating it straight from the pot, a quick meal before heading outside to play or finishing homework at the kitchen table. It may not have been a dinner guests would rave about, But for those who remember it, the taste still lingers as a reminder of simpler times and just how far a few basic ingredients could go. Barley risotto with mushrooms during the Dust Bowl was an interesting character study. On one hand, you had the middle class and below imitating risotto with barley, which made way for them to enjoy something that was typically reserved for the upper class. It was also one of the first few instances of people starting what would later become known as mock food culture. Do you ever hear about all kinds of mock apple pies, lasagnas, meatloafs? That was a series of recipes that were made with substitute ingredients, and the intention was to mimic the taste, texture, and feeling of otherwise popular dishes. It came out thanks to World War II, but I think the seeds were sown all the way before. Fresh mushrooms were hard, but it was still a lot easier to get wild mushrooms in the Dust Bowl. Eventually, people began to have a talent for foraging, and that was when the dish really came together on a regular basis for everybody. People started to make barley risotto thanks to these, and while traditional risotto was made with fresh mushrooms and arborio rice, people were making do with wild mushrooms and rice wherever they could. When it comes to simple yet elegant meals, few combinations can match the light, flaky fish paired with the richness of lemon butter and the crispness of asparagus. Baked cod or halibut are perfect choices for this dish. Both are mild white fish that take well to a variety of seasonings, but it's the lemon butter that steals the show, bringing a burst of freshness that complements the delicate flavors of the fish. Cod and halibut have been long favorites in American kitchens, especially along the coastlines where they are abundant. Cod, with its firm texture, has been a staple in New England since the colonial era, while halibut is prized for its mild taste and large fillets. Both fish are low in fat but high in protein, making them an excellent choice for a healthy, satisfying dinner. Asparagus, often served alongside fish in this dish, is packed with vitamins and minerals, making it a nutritious addition. The key to a great asparagus side is cooking it just enough to maintain its crunch, while the lemon butter ties everything together in perfect harmony. A meal like this is a reminder that simple ingredients can create something extraordinary. Richard Nixon's 1972 state dinner marked a historic moment in U.S. diplomacy, the first official visit to China by a sitting American president. This dinner symbolized the thawing of Cold War tensions and the beginning of a new chapter in U.S.-China relations. The guest of honor, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, sat across from Nixon, with both leaders eager to foster a new diplomatic era. The menu was designed to honor Chinese culture while offering a taste of traditional Chinese cuisine. The dinner began with the iconic Peking duck, roasted to perfection and served with thin pancakes and hoisin sauce, a true Chinese delicacy. Shark fin soup followed a dish that has long been a symbol of Chinese fine dining. Dim sum, a beloved Chinese appetizer, rounded out the menu, offering a variety of small, flavorful bites. Nixon's guest list was a carefully chosen mix of Chinese officials and U.S. dignitaries, all part of a delicate diplomatic dance aimed at building trust between the two nations. The dinner was a clear message that the U.S. was ready to establish closer ties with China, moving beyond decades of isolation. Nixon, known for his keen understanding of symbolism, reportedly said, "If you can get the Chinese to eat dinner with you, you can talk politics." And talk they did, over a delicious historic meal that forever changed global diplomacy. Apple and nut porridge was a delightful, nutritious dish that would be somewhere in between everyday food and a celebratory treat. Now see, porridge was something that had a lot of colorful variations in the medieval world. Typically, it would be made with oats and millet, but if that wasn't available, then people could also just use different kinds of grains like rye or barley. During harvest season is when the party would really get going, though. That's when people would have abundant access to fruits and nuts, and that's when porridge could be turned into something significantly more special than what they were used to. Wild and homegrown apples were incredibly reliable. They would thrive in pretty much most major European countries. Apple orchards were something that would be seen in most village commons and monasteries too. Apples would be chopped, sliced, and simmered until they were just a little bit sweet, and nuts would be crushed and stirred into the porridge. This was a great breakfast, but if you had honey, some warm spices, and a bit of cream, it was something fit for a feast. While we're on the topic of potatoes, scalloped spuds, or rather, scalloped potatoes, a dish that takes simple potatoes and makes them into rich, creamy, and cheesy masterpieces. I can put my hand in a fire and say that even the pickiest eaters would turn their heads for this dish. When money was a constant issue, scalloped potatoes became a go-to comfort meal for families looking to make something to impress their guests with. But without spending a fortune, of course. Honestly, who could resist a thinly sliced potato, smothered in a rich and creamy sauce? All you needed in order to make this delicacy was some milk, a little butter, and a sprinkle of cheese. And of course, spuds. Now, what you want to do is layer those thinly sliced potatoes in a baking dish and cover them with sauce. Bake until they turn to that perfect golden color. Here's the fun part. Oh, how amazing a dish is when you can alter it in any way you like. You could add onions, ham, or bacon, or even better, a bit of both. But whatever you choose, you won't be disappointed. Scalloped potatoes will be your best friend in times of need. Stuffed peppers. Forget those boring pre-made things you see at the grocery store because stuffed peppers are here to save the day. We're talking about the beautiful bell peppers Grandma made on Thanksgiving. Vibrant red, yellow, or orange peppers are hand-picked and carefully hollowed out and then stuffed with a flavorful mixture of fluffy rice, seasoned ground meat, and your choice of chopped vegetables. Once stuffed, these peppers are baked to perfection until they are tender and crisp. Now, this isn't just a casual meal. Whipping up a stuffed pepper might make you feel like a master chef in the kitchen. It's also a great way to use up leftover rice and ground meat. Bonus points. If you use their visual appeal to trick your children into getting their daily dose of veggies. Yeah, the little ones don't really go for the green peppers on the table, but they might just love these stuffed peppers. You might even add some cheese to top it off. Unfortunately, it is one of those dishes that has faded from many dinner tables. Pizza night didn't always mean delivery or even homemade dough. In many working-class homes, it meant stacking saltine crackers, spreading on a layer of ketchup, topping it with a few slices of cheese, and baking until everything melted together. Cracker crust pizza wasn't quite pizzeria quality, but for families on a budget, it was close enough. Saltine crackers were a pantry staple, cheap and endlessly useful, from soups to snacks to makeshift pizza crusts. Ketchup, with its tangy sweetness, stood in for traditional tomato sauce, affordable and always on hand. Cheese slices, often of the processed variety, melted just enough to bring everything together, while leftover bits of meat, if available, added a little extra substance. The beauty of this dish was its simplicity. No kneading, no waiting for dough to rise. Just a quick assembly and a short trip to the oven. It was a meal kids could make themselves, often eaten straight from a baking sheet in front of the television. For those who grew up on it, cracker crust pizza was a memory of late nights, after-school snacks, and the magic of turning a handful of basic ingredients into something that, for all its simplicity, still felt like a treat. Let's head on over to how people did things in the winter. Acorn squash with wild rice and herbs was one of the best holiday season combinations to have during all this mess, and that was for a few reasons. Wild rice was a regional thing. It was an important food source for indigenous communities that had long-held traditions around foraging and growing it. They knew what they were doing, so despite the toughness of the Dust Bowl's environment, they managed to get away with some amount of it. Herbs, on the other hand, were very bare bones. You had your pantry staples like oregano, mint, thyme, and parsley, but beyond that, you shouldn't expect much. Acorn squash was the real star of the show here. It could be used in a lot of things, but that wasn't what was special about it. This was one resilient crop. I mean, seriously, it barely failed. Comparatively to all the others, it seemed like squashes were still far easier to grow than most other things. It is only natural for people to then start adopting things like acorn squash with wild rice and herbs into their diet. They had already become a lot more familiar with wild rice than you'd expect, but dishes like these, especially in the winter, only hammered that appreciation home even more. Hamburger hash is the unsung hero of the frugal kitchen. Born out of necessity and ingenuity, this dish has been rescuing leftovers and stretching budgets for decades. The concept is simple. Ground beef, diced potatoes, and onions cooked together in a skillet. but its simplicity is exactly what makes it timeless. The origins of hash can be traced to the 17th century, when the term came from the French word hacher, meaning to chop. In America, it evolved into a practical way to repurpose leftover meats. By the 20th century, hamburger hash became a staple in many households, particularly during tough economic times, when every ingredient had to count. Potatoes were the perfect partner, cheap, filling, and versatile. Onions, meanwhile, brought a touch of sweetness to balance the savory beef. Some cooks added a sprinkle of paprika or a dash of Worcestershire sauce for an extra punch of flavor. While it may not have the glamour of a Sunday roast, hamburger hash had one major advantage. It came together fast, a blessing on busy weeknights. Hamburger hash proves that even leftovers can shine, especially if you fry them just right. It's a humble dish with a big heart, reminding us that great meals don't need complicated recipes. Ulysses S. Grant's presidency marked a turning point in state dinners, elevating them from domestic gatherings to formal diplomatic showcases. In 1874, Grant hosted the first official state dinner for a foreign head of state, King Kalakaua of Hawaii. At a time when the United States was expanding its influence in the Pacific, the dinner symbolized a burgeoning partnership with Hawaii and Grant's vision of global diplomacy. The guest list reflected the dinner's significance, including prominent government officials and, of course, King Kalakaua, the first Hawaiian monarch to visit the U.S. This event underscored the growing ties between the nations, and Grant used the occasion to highlight America's commitment to fostering international relationships. The menu was as grand as the occasion, blending American and European culinary traditions. Guests were served oysters on the half-shell, roast quail, and terrapin stew, always a favorite among 19th-century elites. For dessert, ices molded into intricate shapes of fruits and flowers added a theatrical flair to the evening. King Kalakaua, who was passionate about modernizing Hawaii, was reportedly quite taken by the evening's elegance. Meanwhile, Grant, known more for his battlefield strategy than his social graces, famously remarked that the food spoke well enough for itself. Hard cheese and bread is one of the oldest and most memorable pairings from the medieval period, and bread and cheese were some of the most core meals for people back then. It wasn't even a specific group of people, it was almost everyone. Monks, shepherds, travelers, nomads, farmers, fishermen, peasants, and even citizens. Bread would be made using whatever kind of grains were possibly available, and they were the typical ones we have gone over so far. If you were rich, you would just be eating wheat, and that was always a dead giveaway that you were rich too. The class disparity back then was pretty black and white. In the middle and lower classes, as they existed back then, you would get to see several different kinds of breads, like dark and rough ones, or fluffy but dense ones. Hard cheese was something that was favored over other kinds of dairies because it could be stored for a very long period without spoiling anything. Cheesemaking was something that was an extremely rural activity, and it was practiced in all kinds of homes, monasteries, and farms. Milk from sheep would be curdled via rennet and pressed, then salted and aged to make firm cheese. It was a practice that would go on throughout France, Switzerland, and even England. Vegetable pot pie was proof that you didn't need meat to make a satisfying meal. When times were tough and the meat was either too pricey or just plain unavailable, families turned to the next best thing: vegetables. Awful alternative for all of us who hate veggies, but you had to do what you had to do just to get by. The humble pot pie, traditionally packed with chicken or beef, took a vegetable-only turn during the Great Depression. It consisted of hearty vegetables like potatoes, carrots, peas, and some onions. Vegetable pot pie was a filling, flavorful dish that still gave you that comforting feeling of a homemade meal. And nobody here can even imagine what that must have felt like. When all you ate were just scraps of whatever you could find, getting a vegetable pot pie must have felt like getting a roasted steak. Plus, it was a great way to use up whatever was in the garden or on sale at the market. No meat? No problem. Those veggies could stand their ground. Cooking a vegetable pot pie wasn't only about stretching the budget, it was also about creativity. You could throw in whatever comes to mind and call it dinner. If you, by some miraculous chance, Got any canned tuna? That would go in there also. And let's be honest, upon cracking open that golden crust, it didn't matter what lay inside. It only mattered that you had food on the table. Scalloped chicken casserole. Here's another classic casserole that deserves a comeback. This dish is the perfect example of simple but mouth-watering good. I mean, just imagine tender chicken pieces in a creamy sauce, seasoned to perfection, and layered with fluffy breadcrumbs. I think I'm feeling hungry now. Scalloped chicken casserole is a great way to use up leftover chicken, and it's perfect for a quick and easy weeknight meal. Not to mention, it's a dish that's sure to please even the pickiest eaters. Who can resist creamy chicken and crispy breadcrumbs? Ditch your takeout menus for a night and take a trip down memory lane by giving this casserole a try. You can find dozens of recipes on the internet, and it won't take you hours to whip up. Trust me, your taste buds will thank you. When dinner had to come together fast and money was tight, there was one golden rule. Nothing went to waste. Leftover potatoes, stray bits of meat, a spoonful of peas from last night's dinner, it all had a place in the baking dish. Held together with a can of condensed soup or a ladle of thick gravy, garbage plate casserole was less about following a recipe and more about cleaning out the fridge. Working-class families in the 1960s didn't have the luxury of throwing away food, and casseroles like this turned scraps into something filling. Canned soups, especially cream of mushroom or cream of chicken, were kitchen workhorses, stretching ingredients while adding richness. Crackers or breadcrumbs on top gave it that familiar golden crust, making it feel like a meal rather than a collection of leftovers. It was never the same dish twice, but that was part of its charm. One night it might taste like last Sunday's roast beef. The next, it had the essence of yesterday's pork chops. No one knew exactly what they were going to get, but that didn't matter. It was warm, it was filling, and most importantly, it was a reminder that a little creativity could turn scraps into supper. The Dust Bowl was hardship personified. Things like lentil and kale stew were honestly very necessary for the overall survival of people. Hearty greens like that would last, could resist the extreme weather and environment, and were most of all really nutritious. This was a time where you wanted to eat just about anything that strengthened your immune system. It wasn't just the lack of good food that was making it easier for people to get sick, it was also the lack of access to health care. People couldn't afford doctors, and the worst of the Dust Bowl hit all of the slums and rural areas that occupy the outskirts of so many states. This meant that a lot of lower and working-class people regularly just ate so that the chances of getting sick were less and less, though despite their best efforts, they would eventually fall sick as well. Lentil and kale stew is as super as a food can get, and I mean that in every sense, but it's not an end-all be-all. What it is, though, is a very hearty stew that works great around the winter months for an entire family. You could spin this around a few different ways for variety, and it would still work, but the kids definitely had a tough time getting used to something like this. Can't really blame them either. I'm an adult, and I still struggle with kale. While macaroni and cheese is often considered the ultimate comfort food, adding stewed tomatoes turns it into something unique, balancing the creamy, cheesy richness with a hint of tangy sweetness. Macaroni and cheese dates back to the early 1700s, with recipes appearing in both European and American cookbooks. The combination of pasta and cheese was revolutionary, and its popularity soared when processed cheese became widely available in the 20th century. By the 1950s, boxed versions made it easier than ever to bring the dish to the table. As for stewed tomatoes, they've been a pantry staple in many households, especially during the harvest season. Stewing tomatoes was a way to preserve the bounty of summer for colder months. When paired with macaroni and cheese, the acidic tomatoes cut through the richness of the cheese, providing a satisfying contrast. While it might seem like a basic dish, macaroni and cheese with stewed tomatoes is the kind of meal that hits the spot every time. William Howard Taft's presidency was a time when the U.S. was flexing its muscle in the Pacific, and his state dinners played a key role in reinforcing America's growing influence. One notable event in 1911 aimed to strengthen ties with Asian nations, particularly Japan and China, while also promoting trade. As the U.S. emerged as a global power, Taft saw these gatherings as opportunities to forge economic partnerships, and he wasn't about to let a dinner go by without putting America's best foot forward. The guest list was packed with Japanese and Chinese diplomats, along with business leaders who could help cement the U.S.'s economic dominance in the region. The dinner was a diplomatic maneuver designed to promote cooperation and open markets. The menu, an elegant blend of Asian and Western flavors, was carefully selected to impress. It started with consommé with dumplings, followed by roast pheasant, a dish of both sophistication and American tradition. Pineapple fritters brought a tropical flair to the table, while chocolate eclairs added a sweet French touch. These dishes represented the bridging of cultures. Taft, known for his size, was not one to skimp on dinner. At one dinner, he famously remarked, "A president's work is never done, especially when the food is this good." But more than satisfying appetites, these dinners were about strengthening ties that would help shape the Pacific's future. Next on our list, we have boiled beans with garlic, which was an incredible staple across Europe, especially among monks and peasants. While peasants liked it because it was one of the few affordable things that they could get, monks liked them because of the sheer simplicity and health benefits. It kind of makes me feel really bad about how much unnecessary junk I eat when I do videos like this. These beans were one of the primary legumes that would be grown in medieval fields, and one of the most common ones were fava beans. These had become pretty native to the Old World, and they were even older than much of the beans we use today, like pinto, kidney, or black beans. Fava beans were incredibly resistant and tough, and they could work through the winter very well. They also did amazing whenever you would mix them in with garlic. It was one of the most affordable seasoning plants, and it could grow in climates that were otherwise too rough to support much crop growth. People kept it for medicinal purposes, as a flavoring, and as a last resort meal too. It was very common for Italian dishes in that era to feature sage, olive oil, and garlic as primary ingredients in most dishes. Monastic communities also relied on boiled beans and garlic as it became a particularly good friend in their endeavor to sustain meatless diets forever. Dandelion green salad was probably one of the most resourceful dishes to come out of the Great Depression era. The Great Depression was the worst economic downfall in the United States history. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and that marked the beginning of the end for some people. From October 1929 till the end of 1930, America was at a standstill. It's needless to say, people had a hard time putting food on the table while still trying to keep the family members healthy and happy. So, when money was tight and grocery shopping wasn't an option, people had to turn to their own gardens for some free food. You might be thinking to yourself, is there another type of dandelion that I do not know about? And the answer is no, just your regular grow-in-the-park dandelion. What most of us right now consider a park flower or a pesky weed, people considered a nutritious and, even more important, free source of greens back in the day. Dandelions may have a bit of a bitter bite, but you had to work with what nature gave you. So adding some salt and vinegar was a must. And that's all it took to turn these lawn invaders into a Great Depression-era salad. Families would head out with baskets and pick out an enormous amount of dandelions. So, with no grocery list and no checkout lines, people went out and got their ingredients. But hey, not only did they stretch the food budget, but they also kept their lawns clean and fresh. Talk about multitasking. Moving on to lamb might seem like a fancy restaurant thing these days, but back in the day, it was a total dinnertime MVP. Lamb stew was a fan favorite at dinner parties back in the day, and I get the hype. Imagine the combination of melt-in-your-mouth lamb and an assortment of colorful vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and peas simmered in a rich, flavorful broth just begging to be soaked with some crusty bread. This is a dish that's guaranteed to warm you up from the inside out on a chilly day. Not to mention, it's surprisingly easy to make. Perfect for those nights when you want a delicious meal without spending hours in the kitchen. Just maybe don't tell your grandma you added a sprinkle of your favorite hot sauce. Some traditions are best left untouched. Long before store-bought bread was an everyday staple, cornmeal was the backbone of many working-class meals. Cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile, It found its way into countless recipes, none more practical than corn dodgers. These simple golden brown dumplings were either fried to crisp perfection or baked until firm, then served with a drizzle of syrup or a pat of butter. Corn dodgers were a direct descendant of Depression-era survival cooking, when wheat flour was too expensive for daily use. Cornmeal, on the other hand, was affordable and widely available, especially in the South and Midwest. Mixed with a little water, salt, and sometimes a splash of milk, it formed a dough sturdy enough to hold its shape in the frying pan. The result was a crispy on the outside, tender on the inside bite of pure comfort. Paired with a bit of molasses or honey, whatever was on hand, it became a meal that kids actually looked forward to. Some families made them dense and chewy, while others leaned toward a lighter, almost hush-puppy-like texture. However they were served, one thing was certain. Corn dodgers proved that even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something satisfying. No frills, no waste, just good, honest food. Sometimes tradition would really come in handy. Okra stew with tomatoes and onions was a fine example of that. In southern U.S. culture, it was really common for people to pass down recipes of this dish within their own families, especially in predominantly African communities. Still, okra stew wasn't exclusive to any one group of people. Even those who came from the Middle East or had Mediterranean influences were making it. The reason it was so good was because it was one of the few dishes people were having which actually still had some flavor to it. Most of the stuff I'm describing right now, you can literally count the amount of ingredients in it by one hand. Not only that, they're not really pairing it up with any kind of cream, sauce, or dressing, so there's just not a lot of room for flavor. Not much to do with seasoning either. It gets bland, it gets dry, and it gets hard to eat for the 50th time in the past 2 months. Okra stew with tomatoes and onions wasn't something that had this problem. You could use canned tomatoes, a vegetable broth, some garlic you grew in the backyard, dried oregano and thyme, some vinegar if you had it, and then that was it. It sounded simple enough, and in practice it was. But it was so much more than just a dish. It was a silver lining. Do you know that feeling of coming back home to your favorite leftovers? That's just a happy coincidence for us, but imagine that in a time where you barely eat or barely get to eat after a long day of work. Don't you think the feeling would hit that much harder? With a name that evokes a French bistro and a flavor that feels like home-cooked comfort, chicken fricassee bridges the gap between elegance and nostalgia. This classic combines tender chicken with a creamy, flavorful sauce and an assortment of vegetables. The roots of chicken fricassee lie in French cuisine, with the term fricassee appearing as early as the 15th century. What sets it apart is the technique. Chicken pieces are first browned lightly, then simmered slowly in a sauce that often blends broth, cream, and a touch of white wine. Julia Child famously described it as halfway between a sauté and a stew, and if Julia said it, it must be true. Vegetables like carrots, celery, mushrooms, and pearl onions elevate the dish, adding texture and natural sweetness to complement the savory chicken. In many American households, this meal became a way to transform humble ingredients into something elegant. While its name might sound intimidating, chicken fricassee is surprisingly practical. It's one pot, easy to make, and the leftovers taste even better the next day, if they survive that long. Fricassee is the dish that makes you feel like you've been to Paris, even if your passport expired decades ago. Thomas Jefferson's state dinners were where politics met fine dining. Known for his love of French culture and cuisine, Jefferson used these events to foster diplomacy and cultural exchange, especially with his favorite ally, France. He believed a good meal could accomplish what hours of debate often could not, fostering goodwill. The guest list included French diplomats, influential political figures, and intellectuals. Jefferson, ever the Francophile, ensured the evening reflected his appreciation for French sophistication. The purpose of this clever move was to strengthen ties with France and subtly communicate that America, though young, had a refined cultural identity. The menu was quintessential Jefferson: bouilli, a French-style boiled beef with vegetables, paired with macaroni pie, a precursor to today's mac and cheese. Jefferson himself had brought a pasta machine back from France, so he didn't just serve mac and cheese, he introduced it to America. Dessert featured his personal favorite, ice cream, a rare and luxurious treat at the time, and of course fine French vines to wash it all down. Jefferson is credited with popularizing macaroni, wine, and even ice cream in the United States. Such a culinary trendsetter. For Jefferson, a state dinner was a declaration of taste, diplomacy, and, yes, a bit of indulgence. We're really starting to explore the deep end of medieval countryside cuisine now, so I hope you're still tuned. Our next item happens to be turnip stew, which is a textbook example of how people got their nutrition in those times. Potatoes were not actually the most widespread ingredient like they are today. It used to be turnips. This was especially true for Europe, where potatoes arrived by the 16th century. Turnips were favored because they could be preserved very easily in root cellars for winter. They were really easy to grow in poor soils, and they were hardy. Also, this was one of the few crops where even its root was edible. It wasn't a dish that had a lot of guidelines to follow, so in that respect it was a lot similar to how pottage worked. People would throw in whatever herbs, roots, aromatics, and scraps of meat and protein they had. One of the best things that would go along with turnip stew if it was available was beetroot and eggplant, which might be a surprise combination for you to hear, but was actually fairly common back then. When times were tough, nothing went to waste, especially not bread. Instead of tossing out stale loaves, families turned them into dumplings to stretch meals further, and tomato soup became the perfect partner for this duo. You'd take some day-old bread, mix it with a little milk and maybe an egg if you had one, and form it into dumplings. Then, plop those into a pot of your regular tomato soup, and you've just transformed a basic dish into something served at restaurants. The bread dumplings would soak up that rich tomato flavor, making every bite feel more flavorful. It was a genius way to avoid food waste and make the most out of what was on hand. Not to mention that tomato soup was already a favorite since it was cheap and easy to make from canned tomatoes. The bread dumplings were just a cherry on top, or dare I say, the dumpling in soup. Together, they created a hearty, satisfying meal that filled you up without costing too much. And that is a win-win in my book. Okay, creamed spinach and pearl onions didn't look the most appetizing, but trust me, it was always a hit at family dinners. Think of a rich, creamy base packed with vibrant green spinach leaves. And let's not forget the star of the show, pearl onions, that added the perfect touch of sweetness. Not only was this dinner finger-licking delicious, but it was healthy too. Jam-packed with nutrients including vitamins A, C, and K, iron, folate, potassium, and a good amount of fiber. Just don't blame me if you get flashbacks to your school cafeteria. But hey, sometimes those cafeteria classics deserve a second chance, especially when they're this delicious and healthy all at the same time. Mid-century America had a love affair with convenience, and nothing sold homemakers on a recipe faster than a catchy advertising campaign. In the 1960s, Wesson Oil promoted a dish that promised flavor, affordability, and, of course, a little Wessonality. It started with ground beef, one of the most budget-friendly proteins of the era, mixed with canned green beans and tomato soup, then topped with a generous handful of crushed potato chips. A little crunch, a little sauce, and a whole lot of practicality. Wessonality Surprise was designed for speed and efficiency. No complicated steps, no long cooking times. Just a few pantry staples thrown together and baked into something that resembled a casserole. Canned green beans, already a staple in American kitchens, made the dish feel like a balanced meal, while the condensed tomato soup added a rich, slightly sweet tang. For families in the 60s, this kind of cooking was about making every dollar count. It was fast, it was filling, and thanks to Wesson's marketing, it became one of many quirky ad-driven meals that defined a generation of home cooking. A little strange? Maybe. But for busy families, it worked. So, the next thing we have is roasted carrots with parsnips and herb butter. Now, I know you've heard a lot about how butter was barely available during the Depression, and especially the Dust Bowl. Herb butter, on the other hand, is a bit different from the traditional butter you've heard about. This is also a pretty standard custom that's existed throughout the history of the United States, especially in communities like the Native American ones. What really is it, though? Herb butter is basically just butter mixed in with a cocktail of different herbs. You put in basil, parsley, thyme, oregano, basically anything and everything you have. It's been a thing for people who had access to gardens or farming land, and a lot of rural areas would also grow loads of herb butter. This is because they already had space to grow so many herbs that herb butter was simply the next step on the road. This is pretty much one of the best ways you can enjoy your butter, as it really adds an entirely new world of flavor to just about whatever it is you're making. This is even more true for something like roasted carrots and parsnips. I mean, let's be honest, the roasting definitely helps, but it's not like we're working with a lot of flavor here. Tamale pie is an American dish that brings together the heartiness of ground beef, the comfort of a cornmeal topping, and a blend of savory seasonings that make it a family favorite. While the name might suggest a traditional tamale, tamale pie is actually a casserole that layers these ingredients for a meal that's both satisfying and easy to make. The dish likely has its roots in the Southwest, where tamales have been a staple in Mexican cuisine for centuries. However, tamale pie emerged in the United States in the mid-20th century as a more accessible version, taking the flavors of tamales and turning them into a bake. Ground beef is browned with onions, garlic, and chili powder, then topped with a cornmeal batter and baked until golden. The result is a savory pie with a cornmeal crust that mimics the texture of a tamale. Tamale pie quickly became a favorite for home cooks thanks to its simplicity and versatility. It could be customized with ingredients like cheese, olives, or even jalapenos to suit personal tastes. Some families served it with a side of cornbread or a dollop of sour cream for extra richness. Tamale pie is proof that you don't need a fancy tamale press to make a meal that's full of flavor. Simple, hearty, and always a crowd pleaser. George H.W. Bush's state dinner in 1990 was a momentous occasion, held at the end of the Cold War, a historic turning point in U.S. history. The dinner celebrated not only the triumph of democracy, but also the U.S.'s leadership in bringing an end to the decades-long standoff with the Soviet Union. Hosted in honor of Mikhail Gorbachev, the dinner marked the beginning of a new era of U.S.-Russia relations. The menu was as lavish as the occasion, beginning with a delicate lobster tail, followed by a perfectly prepared filet mignon, both symbolizing the elegance and strength of the U.S. at the time. To cap off the evening, the guests were served baked Alaska, a decadent dessert that would have made any Cold War adversary melt. Gorbachev, along with European leaders, were invited to the dinner, where the focus was on celebrating democracy's victory and fostering an atmosphere of cooperation between the U.S. and the former Soviet Union. The dinner was a powerful symbol of the diplomacy that led to the peaceful end of the Cold War and the beginning of a more hopeful international landscape. Bush, with his characteristic humor, quipped that baked Alaska was the perfect dessert to represent the collapse of the Soviet Union. A little fiery on the outside, but soft and warm on the inside. The dinner served as a reminder that while the world was changing, the U.S. would remain a steadfast leader. Curd cheese with herbs is a really good example of how even the simplest of ingredients and medieval-era foods could be turned into perfectly nice snacks or lunches. Curd cheese was also known as white cheese, and it wasn't like hard cheese. This one was much more readily available and quicker to make. You would curdle the milk with rennet and vinegar, and then you would drain all the way to leave a really soft and fresh curd. This was extremely common in households where dairy herds and weekly cheese making was done so that milk could be prevented from spoiling. Europe also, interestingly enough, had different names for this depending on what areas you would find yourself in. Places that largely spoke German, for example, would call it quark. It was known as brocue in certain parts of France. Also, in urban homes or wealthier ones, curd cheese would be made with spices and served with fruits for a nice little sweet and savory twist. While on the topic of soup, let's not forget to mention onion soup. And since it is fall and fall is the soup-making season, maybe you'll get an idea or two on what to make for your next dinner. The onion soup was proof that even the humblest ingredients could make a delicious meal. In case you didn't know, when you're working on a tight budget, onions become your best mates. They were widely available and quite cheap at the time, so they were the go-to vegetable in hard times. When you mix a few onions and some broth, even if it's just water and a bouillon cube, you'll get yourself a soup that's rich in flavor but light on your wallet. The thing that makes onion soup such a classic and timeless meal is its simplicity. Though caramelizing onions takes a bit of time and patience, they add a depth of flavor that makes you forget you're eating something as simple as soup. Once they hit that sweet golden spot, there's no coming back. With just a few ingredients, you can create something that feels gourmet, even when times are lean. But we can't forget the bread and cheese. No onion soup is complete without them. Traditionally, a slice of bread and a sprinkle of cheese are broiled on top, but even without this fancy finish, onion soup remains a delicacy of this time. What fascinates me about onion soup is that it manages to make an ingredient such as an onion the star of the show, making it into a bowl of comfort that feels like a splurge, even though it is not. Chicken fried steak. This classic is long gone but never forgotten. This one's pretty easy to make too. All you need is a chicken steak dredged in a seasoned flour mixture, dipped in a wet batter, and finally coated in a crispy breading. Fry till it's golden brown for the perfect dinner that'll leave you wanting more. Chicken fried steak is typically served with a creamy gravy for dipping, along with mashed potatoes and vegetables for a complete and oh-so-satisfying meal. It is basically American, and the yassified version of the Austrian dish Wiener Schnitzel, and the Italian dish cotoletta alla Milanese. Fancy names, but the same old fried chicken steak. Now I know what you're thinking. Why did this crispy golden goodness leave us too soon? Well, you can trick yourself all you want, but it's not the healthiest dinner out there. But hey, having a fried steak once in a while can't do much harm, right? Just be prepared for some finger-licking good action. This dish is messy, but in the best way possible. A pot of boiling milk or broth, a handful of flour, and a few pinches of salt. Sometimes that was all it took to make a meal. In Amish and working-class households, Rivel soup was a go-to dish when money was tight. Simple bits of dough, known as rivels, were dropped into simmering liquid, forming soft, dumpling-like pieces that gave the soup just enough substance to satisfy. Flour-based dishes like this were a lifeline for families who had to stretch every ingredient. Rivels required no rolling, no rising, just flour, egg, and a little patience. As the tiny dumplings cooked, they thickened the broth, turning it into something more filling than a simple soup. Some versions used milk for a rich, creamy base, while others relied on broth if meat was available. Either way, it was hearty, nourishing, and incredibly affordable. This was comfort food at its most basic. Warm, easy to digest, and a staple on cold winter nights. For those who grew up eating it, the sight of rivels forming in a rolling pot of soup brings back memories of big family tables and the kind of simple, home-cooked meals that didn't rely on anything fancy, just tradition, a little flour, and a warm bowl to hold. Parsnip and lentil stew was a really good dish. It had the earthiness of parsnips, which were a common thing to grow and buy in farmers' markets and grocery stores. And then you also had lentils. This was a lot better than the potato soups people had become accustomed to all the time while they were trying to make the day go by. It was rustic, nutritious, and it actually was the perfect thing to eat when it was cold. During the winter, it became so hard to afford to spend money on any kind of heating arrangements or winter shoppings. Parsnips and lentil stew was also a vegan-friendly meal, and if you think they hold on to their recipes now, you should have seen them back then. Man, nobody made life easy for them. The best thing about this stew was that you could adapt it to whatever it was you had on hand and could work with. Whether that was medium carrots, celery, tomatoes and onions, or chicken broths and herbs, it would work. All you had to do was adjust to taste, and you were ready to go. It was best to eat this warm, though. It wouldn't really work well as a leftover meal. That's why people never made it in bulk unless they were cooking for the entire neighborhood. Turkey and gravy, traditionally a centerpiece of Thanksgiving but often enjoyed beyond the holiday season, holds a special place in American culinary history. Its pairing with mashed turnips, though less common today, harkens back to a time when root vegetables were staples in kitchens for their affordability and long storage life. Turkey has been an American icon since colonial days. Benjamin Franklin famously praised the bird, calling it a much more respectable bird than the bald eagle. While roasting turkey might be associated with grand feasts, smaller versions, like turkey breasts, frequently appeared on mid-century dinner tables, making the meal more practical for everyday cooking. The star of the plate, next to the turkey, is the gravy. Made from the drippings left in the pan, it's rich, savory, and ties everything together. A good gravy, as some would say, can salvage even a dry turkey. Often overshadowed by mashed potatoes, turnips were a go-to side dish in earlier generations. Packed with nutrients and a slightly peppery flavor, they offered a lighter, unique alternative to spuds. Mashed with butter, cream, or even a touch of maple syrup, they brought earthy warmth to the plate. If turkey is the headliner, gravy is the conductor. And turnips? They're the backup singers you never knew you needed. A harmonious meal indeed. Jimmy Carter's presidency was defined by a commitment to human rights and global diplomacy, and one of his signature state dinners in 1977 reflected those values. This dinner, held in honor of Middle Eastern leaders and human rights advocates, was a statement of Carter's vision for the world. The meal highlighted his emphasis on global peace and social justice, especially in the Middle East. The menu was a comforting and elegant showcase of American cuisine, beginning with roast lamb, a nod to Middle Eastern culinary traditions, followed by fresh, seasonal vegetables representing Carter's commitment to environmental issues. For dessert, peach cobbler brought a touch of Southern hospitality to the table, a reminder of the president's Georgia roots. Invited guests included leaders from the Middle East, as well as key figures in the human rights movement, with Carter aiming to build bridges across cultural divides. The dinner was a chance for the president to demonstrate U.S. leadership on the world stage, focusing on human rights and encouraging peace in a region often mired in conflict. Carter's belief in diplomacy was so strong that he famously joked, "If this dinner doesn't go well, I'll have to break out the peach cobbler for a second round of peace talks." A meal served with both purpose and charm as Carter worked to use every opportunity to make the world a better place. Mushroom and herb stew is a medieval dish that's pretty timeless. It's still something that a lot of people bring to vegan parties whenever they can. Today, mushrooms are pretty much a gourmet ingredient, but in the medieval period, they were regarded as wild food. It was pretty typical to spend your day foraging at the edge of fields for mushrooms, and laborers who worked in the woods or fields would rely on them all the time. Medieval people had an intuitive knowledge of a vast variety of mushrooms, especially the ones that were available locally. Field mushrooms, also an ancestor of modern-day button mushrooms, morels, chanterelles, and other kinds of wild types were all things they worked with. They were also pretty smart. While they didn't exactly know why certain mushrooms killed them, made them sick, or caused them to see things, they knew to avoid those and how to spot them out, and that's what let them have mushroom-based dishes as a part of their diet in the first place. Fried cornbread, or as some like to call it, hoe cakes, was a Southern staple during the Great Depression that made every meal a bit more enjoyable. When you didn't have much, cornbread was the thing that came to the rescue. It was simple, affordable, and made with ingredients most people had on hand: cornmeal, water, maybe a bit of buttermilk if you were one of God's favorites. Plus, if you throw it in a hot skillet with some oil, you could turn those ingredients into some crispy, golden, and irresistible bites. Fried cornbread was often served with soups or beans, two other Depression-era staples, as you've learned by now. Together, they made a hearty, filling meal that could stretch for days. And I don't know about you, but that crispy cornbread edge is something that always makes my mouth water. Dip it into a bowl of soup or pile on some beans, and suddenly a modest meal feels a little more special. And let's be real, anything fried instantly ups the comforting factor. I mean, just take a look at Kentucky Fried Chicken. Would they be as popular if they were Kentucky Boiled Chicken? I don't think so. Hear me out, this one might sound a little boring at first glance, but trust me, it's a classic for a reason. The split pea soup is a hearty, filling, and surprisingly healthy-ish, thick, creamy soup packed with vibrant green split peas and other vegetables like carrots, celery, and onions. Now, on that healthy-ish claim, it depends on how much butter and cream your grandma used. The split pea soup is the kind of soup that leaves you feeling satisfied for hours. It has been a St. Patrick's Day staple ever since its origin in 1905. The best part? You can totally customize it according to your liking. Yeah, don't be shy to throw in your favorite veggies, add a splash of lemon juice for a bit of brightness, or even some leftover shredded chicken for an extra protein punch. We really need to bring this one back. Stretching ingredients wasn't just a skill in the 1960s, it was a necessity. When a handful of leftover meat and a few vegetables weren't enough for a full meal, they found new life inside a flaky pie crust, topped with a generous layer of mashed potatoes. Hoosier Pie Supper was an answer to the age-old question: what can we make with what we have? Midwestern families, especially in Indiana, had been making similar dishes for generations, influenced by their farming roots and a deep tradition of waste not cooking. Mashed potatoes were a constant in working-class households, cheap, filling, and easy to make in large batches. A single pie could take scraps of roast beef, bits of ham, or even just a few spoonfuls of vegetables and turn them into a meal hearty enough to satisfy a family after a long day's work. It was baked until golden brown, emerging from the oven as a warm, comforting dish that filled the house with a familiar, savory aroma. Served with a ladle of brown gravy, it was about making sure nothing went to waste. In an era where food stretched as far as a paycheck, this dish wasn't just frugal, it was common sense wrapped in a flaky crust. So the next thing on our list is baked turnips and cream sauces. But dear viewer, I know you aren't 5, and I know you're curious about how cream sauces could even be a thing in a time like this. After all, if people were struggling to get enough milk and eggs, where on God's green earth were they finding the money to get cream for? You see, my friend, there was a stark difference in lifestyles between two types of people: those that grew up in the city and those that grew up in the countryside. Now, for the people trapped in those urban jungles during the Dust Bowl, I completely agree with you. Where did they get their cream from? For the ones living in rural shanty towns, though, well, you gotta know that they came from a long tradition of farming, a tradition that by the 1930s was still relatively upheld by most families. This meant that lots of these farming households had their own cattle and cows, and that's how they would get their milk and cream. Baked turnips, on the other hand, were something that was more commonly seen in the cities. It was, after all, something that primarily required an oven. In rural areas, it was a lot more common for people to pass the time with boiled turnips instead, but sometimes people would get lucky and find themselves having baked turnips along with a cream sauce to go with it. Fish sticks, those crispy, golden-breaded delights, have been a fixture of American family dinners since the mid-20th century. While their origins date back to the early 1950s, when commercial frozen food production boomed, fish sticks quickly became a go-to for busy families. Made from white fish, typically cod or pollock, these little rectangular pieces of seafood are battered and deep-fried to perfection, making them as crunchy on the outside as they are tender on the inside. The classic pairing of fish sticks with tartar sauce elevates the meal. Tartar sauce, a tangy combination of mayonnaise, pickles, and lemon juice, adds a creamy contrast to the crispy fish. While the sauce has its roots in French cuisine, it became a beloved accompaniment to fish and chips, and later to fish sticks in the US. On the side, coleslaw, a salad made from finely shredded raw cabbage, carrots, and a tangy dressing, has been a popular addition to fish dishes for generations. Its crisp texture and slightly sweet flavor balance out the richness of the fish and tartar sauce. Abraham Lincoln's state dinners were a reflection of the man himself, straightforward, practical, and deeply rooted in purpose. Hosted during the harrowing years of the Civil War, these gatherings aimed to foster unity and provide a rare sense of normalcy in an otherwise fractured nation. Lincoln used the dinners as a symbol of resilience, showing that even amid national turmoil, the presidency endured and the Union still had a table big enough for everyone. at least metaphorically. The guest list included government officials, military leaders, and the occasional international visitor. These weren't lavish affairs, but purposeful ones, focused on building connections and fostering collaboration among those tasked with holding the country together. If tensions were high on the battlefield, Lincoln hoped a shared meal could, at least for an evening, encourage mutual understanding. The menu was humble but hearty, reflective of Lincoln's simpler approach to the presidency. Roast turkey and ham provided the staples, accompanied by corn pudding and apple pie for dessert, a nod to tradition and comfort. Lincoln, who famously had little interest in food himself, was more focused on the company than the cuisine. He believed these dinners were about people, not pomp. As one guest quipped, Lincoln wasn't there to impress your palate. He was there to hear your ideas and maybe share a story or two. In that way, his dinners truly embodied the union he sought to preserve. Baked apples with honey were such an incredible medieval dish that they were especially for any kind of party or celebration. The baking was always done near the fire or a hearth oven, and the dish was incredibly simple. It really was just an apple that was baked whole with honey drizzled over it, or sometimes they would simply dip the whole thing in honey. People would also boil the apples first and then bake them to get a dish that resembled the texture of apple pudding as we know it today. This dish was eaten at the end of a course or as a fast day meal, and honey and apples were things that you could eat on days where you had to fast. The combination of a softened, decadent apple mixed in with caramelized golden honey was something that scratched all the right itches. Baked apples with honey had an incredibly strong association with festive and seasonal meals, and they were particularly really popular around harvest and Christmas. Apples were abundant, and honey was something that people could spare sometimes for the right kind of occasion. This dish is something you see in medical texts, estate records, cookbooks, and other medieval-era references. Apples were also prized because of how easy they were to store. Break time. 1 second. Navy bean soup was one of the Depression-era lifesavers, especially when it came to those government surplus food boxes handed out to families in need. In times when options were limited, a bag of Navy beans came in hand and saved the day. These little white beans might not look like much, but when simmered in a big pot with some water and maybe a bit of ham or bacon, they transformed into a soup of your dreams that could feed a family for days. Navy beans are packed with protein, and they could fill you up and leave you satisfied, which was exactly what families in need were craving in those hard times when meat was scarce and expensive. The longer it simmered, the better it tasted, which meant you could make a big batch on Monday and still be eating it on Thursday, with the taste just getting better and better. Even with minimal ingredients, Navy bean soup delivered with the taste. It was humble, yes, no one can disagree on that, but it did what it had to do. Plus, if you had some bread or crackers, this dish could fill you up with warmth and make those hard days a bit more bearable. Remember when your mom used to whip you up lunch for school along with a heartfelt note and a sweet treat? Meat and potato patties were a staple back in the day and a hit in the lunchbox. If you've got some leftover mashed potatoes lying around, you've got to try these. Yeah, these are basically patties made out of mashed potatoes combined with seasoned ground meat, shaped into little discs, and fried till golden brown. They pair perfectly with ketchup, your favorite dipping sauce, or even a dollop of sour cream for a tangy twist. Meat and potato patties are the ultimate finger food that is still a hit to this day. Well, with McDonald's French fries on the rise, these really don't make an appearance that often, but you can whip these patties up anytime. They're surprisingly easy to make. Just give your mom a call and ask for the recipe. When money was tight, dinner often came down to whatever was left in the pantry. A bag of egg noodles, a bottle of ketchup, and a bit of margarine. That was all it took to put a meal on the table. Ketchup and egg noodles weren't gourmet, but they were quick, cheap, and filling. Egg noodles were a working-class staple, cheaper than other pasta and often bought in bulk. Ketchup, always within arm's reach in American households, doubled as an instant sauce, adding a tangy sweetness that made the dish feel a little less plain. A pat of margarine, more affordable than butter, gave the noodles just enough richness to round everything out. The result? A meal that may not have won any awards but kept bellies full. Dishes like this weren't about taste as much as practicality. They came together in minutes, required no special skills, and could be made by kids home alone after school. Some families added a sprinkle of black pepper, while others stirred in a little sugar to cut the acidity of the ketchup. For those who grew up eating it, the memory of steaming hot noodles coated in that unmistakable red sauce brings back a time when dinner didn't have to be complicated, it just had to get the job done. Canned tuna, condensed soup, and a box of cornflakes. 3 pantry staples that, when combined, became a casserole that defined weeknight dinners for collard green wraps with black beans and corn is a pretty loaded dish, especially for Dust Bowl era standards. Where do we really start here? The greens weren't really that available throughout the Depression and Dust Bowl. It was because dried beans and corn were a staple in so many houses that not many could snatch them up for themselves. There was always a decent amount of people that were either too late, couldn't go, or just got unlucky. Corn wasn't that much of an issue, given how easy it was to grow, and how just about everyone became really good at growing it. Black beans were harder to come by, though. Still, when people did get it, they would definitely take advantage of it with this recipe. Collard greens and black beans were also. If you really wanted to get fancy with it, technically some people did add bits of leftover meat or ham and potatoes to it. They would also add in some ground meat, some rice, quinoa, or whatever else they were working with. Anything that would make the filling, well, more filling was good. It helped to have a dish like this because it reminded people of the times they were able to go out for a night on the town and eat good food. Pork chops with scalloped potatoes was a duo so perfectly matched, it's as if they were destined to share the same plate. This meal became a dinnertime favorite for its balance of simplicity and satisfaction. Tender, pan-seared pork chops alongside creamy, cheesy potatoes. It's no wonder it earned its spot in the hearts and stomachs of families everywhere. The secret to scalloped potatoes lies in their layers. Thinly sliced potatoes are smothered in a rich, velvety sauce made from milk or cream, often with a touch of cheese, and baked until golden and bubbling. The dish likely evolved from French gratin dauphinois, but American cooks put their own spin on it by using cheese more liberally. Pork chops, on the other hand, have always been a practical choice for home cooks. Affordable and quick to prepare, they pair perfectly with the creamy potatoes, creating a meal that's hearty yet approachable. To many, the crispy edges of the potatoes and the seared crust on the pork chops were the best part. This meal is like a warm hug in casserole form. The only downside is that it's impossible to stop at just one serving. And really, who would want to? James Madison's state dinners were as much about diplomacy as they were about distraction. Elegant escapes during the turbulent War of 1812. At the heart of these events was Dolly Madison, the First Lady who practically invented the role of political hostess. While James strategized in the war room, Dolly charmed guests at the dinner table, using social gatherings to build bridges and bolster morale during a time of national uncertainty. The menu reflected both the Madison household's refined tastes and the regional influences of the time. Terrapin stew, a Maryland delicacy made with turtle, was a highlight. For a bold culinary twist, guests were treated to oyster ice cream. While it might make modern diners shudder, it was Dolly's favorite innovation. Seasonal fruits rounded out the offerings, adding a fresh, simple elegance to the table. The guest list included foreign diplomats and Washington's elite, ensuring these gatherings were not only social but politically strategic. Dolly used her charm and hospitality to maintain alliances and foster unity, ensuring that even amid war, the capital remained a hub of civility. Her influence was so profound that one guest joked she was the only First Lady who could make oysters patriotic. And frankly, she probably could. Barley bread is one of the oldest kinds of loaded breads that you can find in European history. It's completely medieval and has a history that goes back thousands of years. This is because among all the grains in the world, barley is arguably one of the first that we ever domesticated. It was first cultivated in the Fertile Crescent, which, if you don't know where that is, it's the area that covers modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. Barley bread was one of the most common kinds of bread in the early Middle Ages, and it went onwards towards the High Middle Ages as well. This was typically considered to be a peasant bread, though. It had a coarse texture, it was darker than other breads, and it did not really have enough gluten. It was hard bread because of that fact. It was actually a bit of a sign of your economic class if you were constantly having barley bread, because only the rich people would get to eat fluffy white loaves of bread like we're used to. While we're on the subject of vegetables, we must mention the classic ragout of vegetables. Ragout of vegetables is a French-inspired stew that is the culinary equivalent of throwing everything together and hoping for the best. Out of all the dishes mentioned, this one is probably the most versatile and surprising. You never truly know what leftovers you have lying around the house, so once you gather them all together in a stew, who knows what you'll make? A few carrots with slight discoloration, a half-rotten tomato, a potato you don't even remember buying. That is what you're working with. But once you chop them all up and throw them in a pot with some broth and herbs, you'll create a bubbly stew in no time. The great thing about ragout is that it is entirely customizable. No two batches will ever be the same, and it's a great way to practice cooking and feel like a gourmet chef. Hey, Gordon Ramsay wasn't born a professional. So next time your vegetable drawer fills up with old veggies, don't just toss them out, but rather make yourself some old-fashioned ragout. Stuffed chicken rolls. Don't you dare confuse these with Mickey D's chicken nuggets. Stuffed chicken rolls are the dinner of every kid's dream, cause who wouldn't want this cheesy goodness instead of some plain old broccoli soup? Imagine thin sliced chicken breasts pounded to tender perfection, and then filled with a savory mixture of seasoned ground ham and melty cheese. Stuffed chicken rolls are a great way to elevate a simple chicken breast, and they're perfect for a special occasion or a fancy weeknight dinner. They're surprisingly easy to make, so don't be intimidated by their fancy appearance. Despite its appeal, stuffed chicken rolls have become less common as people opt for simpler, quicker meals. This has to be by far one of America's greatest inventions because even though it has vanished from dinner tables in the States, other nations around the world are devouring them. Not every seafood dish came from the ocean. Some came straight from a can. In a time when fresh shrimp was a luxury for coastal towns, canned shrimp offered an affordable way for working-class families to bring a little seafood into their diets. Mixed with peas in a thick, creamy white sauce and served over crackers or toast, this dish had a playful name, Shrimp Wiggle. But it was all business when it came to stretching ingredients. Canned shrimp had been around since the early 20th century, marketed as a convenient alternative to fresh shellfish. By the 1960s, it found its way into all kinds of home-cooked meals, from salads to casseroles. In this dish, it was combined with a simple white sauce, a budget-friendly staple made from butter, flour, and milk that turned just about anything into a filling, stick-to-your-ribs meal. The peas added a pop of color and a bit of sweetness, balancing out the richness of the sauce. Served over saltines or toasted white bread, it wasn't fancy, but it was warm, comforting, and familiar. For many kids, it was their first introduction to seafood, whether they liked it or not. Some remember it fondly, while others never quite warmed up to the idea of shrimp that came from a can. Fried eggplants were another thing that people couldn't get enough of during then, especially with spiced tomato sauce. Like I said, it really took a lot of trial and error to find something that had enough flavor to it. This was something that people immediately knew was a gold mine of flavor, though. The eggplant was already spiced, and it was pretty crispy from the frying. The tomato sauce on its own is tangy, which works really well with an eggplant. Still, if you choose to turn it up a notch further and make it even more spicier, then this dish is definitely for you. It also helps that it's completely vegetarian, and like I said, if you're anything but a conventional person, you'll find most relief efforts to not be very accommodating. That was true for people who didn't want to eat much meat, since it took a while for lots of vegetable-based recipes to pop up in mainstream spaces. There was the benefit of wasting no money on meat, though, since, comparatively, any kind of animal or meat was a lot more expensive than a vegetable. This dish worked for reasons like that, but it was also just something that really kept you full. You had a lot of fiber and a lot of vitamin C, and I'm sure I don't need to explain how living in a chronic dust storm can be bad for your skin. Swiss steak, a dish that's neither Swiss nor a steak, but somehow it has become a classic on American dinner tables. The name Swiss refers to the technique of Swissing, a process of tenderizing tougher cuts of beef like round steak by pounding or rolling it out. The result is a melt-in-your-mouth meal that feels far fancier than its humble beginnings. This dish gained popularity in mid-century America when home cooks needed to stretch their budgets. By slow-cooking tenderized beef in a rich tomato-based sauce, the flavors could develop while turning inexpensive cuts into something extraordinary. Onions were essential, adding sweetness and depth to the tangy tomatoes. The result was a savory, satisfying dish perfect for ladling over mashed potatoes, rice, or even buttered noodles. Tomatoes, a key player in Swiss steak, were a practical choice. Canned tomatoes, first popularized in the early 1900s, made this dish accessible year-round. Who can resist the sight of those onions caramelizing in the skillet before being smothered in sauce? One could say Swiss steak is the Cinderella story of the food world. It starts tough, a little rough around the edges, but with a little care and time, it transforms into something utterly irresistible. Proof that sometimes slow and steady wins the race. If you've eaten even one of these meals, you're officially seasoned. Comment your favorite and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.